Bruce Henderson graduated from the Academy Voice School at Penn State University and spent 40 years in journalism, primarily as an editorial page editor and columnist for daily newspapers, and wrote an estimated 10,000 editorials and 2,000 columns in his career. He has won more than 60 national and state awards for editorial and column writing. He served 15 years on the Catholic Church Board and 9 years on the Academy Board of Trustees, and was a founding member of the Mentics Watershed Association, now the Mentics Ecological Restoration Trust. And he worked for 10 years in the Development Office of the General Church and the Academy of the New Church as Director of Development and Director of Communication. He's now in his 5th year as editor of New Church Life. And he is married to my second cousin Carol, and they're about to celebrate their 50th anniversary. They have 3 children and 5 grandchildren. And Bruce also had the distinction of interviewing in the course of his career, which he did not transmit to me, but I know for a fact that he interviewed President Reagan and also Martin Luther King Jr. So a very, very distinguished career. He has authored 3 books and is working on yet another. Is that correct?
The third one is the one that's something like
Third one he's working on, but he has authored Windows to Eternity, which you may well be familiar with, and Why Does God Let It Happen, about divine providence. And as I recall, Bruce, that book came shortly on the heels of the book by the rabbi,
some years afterwards, yeah, I'll talk about that.
some years after that, yeah. And it was about on the theodicy topic.
Right.
Why does God let it happen? So it was my pleasure to introduce Bruce. And after his talk, I will give a very brief overview on the little book Mentics. Just a couple minutes. Thanks.
Bruce, bring the microphone down in your mouth, please.
Right.
Don't swallow, but.
Maybe I could
Just hold it now. How about that? Well, thanks very much, Steve. That was a very generous introduction, a little more than I expected, and I will be happy to concede some time to you at the end. Appreciate you. Also want to give some thanks to Lisa Childs and all the people who set up this day. I don't know if you've seen the displays out in the Brickman Center, but a lot of work went into that, and to get out there, just thank those people that put a lot of work into this. I'm also appreciative of all of you for showing up, especially at lunchtime on a beautiful Saturday when I would be out in our woods or our property if I had my choice. And I know Steve would be out in his garden and his orchard. So especially appreciate all of you coming out on a beautiful day like this. I had no idea when he's asked me to do this if there'd be 5 people here or 50 people, so I'm grateful to all of you for showing up. Lisa asked me if I would give a title to this talk. And I said, why don't you call it The Gift? Because I think we have so many gifts in the teachings that we have from the Lord through Swedenborg, which I'm trying to convey through my books on life after death and providence and the internal sense of the word. So they're all gifts that I get and I'm able to transmit. I also am quick to always point out that I'm not a theologian. I just pretend to be one at times, like when I'm doing New Church Life or Bold. So, but I feel we all have an opportunity. We're all part of the Great Commission to go out and preach to all nations and convey what we've been given. And so I'm trying to do that. I thought in the first 2 presentations we had this morning that Reuben and David were at a very high level, intellectual level, very fascinating. And I'm going to bring us all down to earth a little bit more and give your brains a rest. This is where Swedenborg deals with us where we live. And then Dr. Thompson and Dan Simmonsfeld and Michael Owen will lift you back up again, but we'll take a little break here. The first book, I'm going to talk about all 3 books. One was The Window to Eternity, which was the first book I wrote, Why Does God Let It Happen? And the third book, which I've written and is now in editing process at the Swedenborg Foundation. Hope it'll be published later this year. It's on the internal sense of the word called The Seventh Seal. And I'll talk a little bit about each of these and try to answer some questions at the end, and if I can answer them all, I will, right? Window to Eternity was published almost 30 years ago now in 1987. This was the original. I saw one back here. I think that you had. Which says The Other Life Has Already Begun. This is in its 5th printing now. And the new edition looks like this. And I also have here a Japanese translation, which was given to me in assembly in Guelph, maybe 12, 13 years ago, by a man named Suzuki, who took it upon himself to translate this book into Japanese. And of course, I've never understood a word in it. I was showing it to Sasha Silverman out in the Brickman Center. She spent a year in Japan some years ago teaching English, and she started opening up and reading it. It was very encouraging to me that it does make sense to somebody. And as a matter of fact, I was showing it to John Jin the other day. He shares an office in Cairn Crest just across the hall from me, and he got very excited. He said, "I know this man, Suzuki. I'm going to see him in Japan next week." So he got his phone and took a picture of me holding his book, and he's going to take it to him, and he'll come back and tell me what's happening with the book in Japan. One of the reasons why I started out with life after death as a topic for a book was it's something that everyone deals with. We all have to face death. We all deal with it in our families, with our friends. So everyone has questions and doubts and a lot of fears about what happens and why does it happen and all that sort of thing. And I think it's one of the best introductions that we have for our doctrines on the reality of life after death. So that's what I did with this book about. I think it's also been maybe providential, but at the same time, we're having a lot of these books on near-death experience and proof of heaven and all that sort of thing, which sort of confirm a lot of what Swedenborg is teaching about the reality of life after death. And it's, I think, encouraging that almost everyone who's had a near-death experience comes back and said, "I just love what I saw and I have no fear of death anymore. I can't wait to get back there," which I think has given a lot of people some hope and helps them in their faith. And that's one thing I've tried to do with this book, is to not necessarily persuade people that they need to become Swedenborgians, but just to give them some hope in their lives and to strengthen their own faith. And I've been encouraged by the number of people who've come to me from all different faiths, Catholics, Jewish, all kinds of people, who have said, in effect, this isn't what my faith teaches, but it's what I've always believed. So I think there is just sort of these common perceptions that the Lord gives us that people have been able to take into their lives. So in this book, I get into a lot of what happens when you die, so that people have that feeling that, as we all know, you wake up with your same body, you're surrounded by angels and a sphere of love and all that very nice kind of a feeling that gives people some comfort. I think one of the hardest things for anyone to deal with is the loss of a child. So the chapter on children in heaven was actually Don Rosary produced that as a separate pamphlet a long time. That's a tough question for people to deal with, and when they get a sense of their children being in heaven and how they're raised there, it's very comforting to them. Also the concept of marriage in heaven, that people have to know that people are happily married, will be together to eternity, and that everyone will have a conjugal partner in heaven. That's a very comforting thing. I think one of the nicest teachings that we have, which is very appealing to visitors, is that everyone can get into heaven. You don't have to be baptized in a certain faith, join a certain church. If you just live a good life, believe in God, you can get into heaven. And I think that's a very appealing thing that we can build on. Also try to give people a sense that their spiritual life isn't something that happens when you die and go into the spiritual world. We're in our spiritual life right now. are making choices every day that are either choosing heaven or choosing against heaven. And throughout our life, we're really making that choice of where we'll end up. It isn't just going to be a judgment when we get there. We'll be choosing the place where our spirit will find its home. And I also decided to point out to people, if you're going on a trip to a foreign country, especially a culture that maybe to Asia or somewhere you're not at all familiar with, or maybe you're being transferred there, the first thing you do is try to find out as much about that country as you can, what their culture is, what you can expect in the way of all sorts of things. So we ought to be doing that with our spiritual lives as well, just preparing for what we're going to experience. And the more prepared we can be, and the more in tune we are with the choices that we're making, the more helpful that can be. Some of the nice responses this book has gotten. I have a cousin in New England who told me years ago about a neighbor who had a college-age son who died in a mountain climbing accident. And he gave the book Window to Eternity to this boy's mother. And she said that as she read it, she could feel the presence of her son with her, saying in effect that this is all true, I'm fine, I'm really doing well. And she was so comforted by that. And then she in turn gave it to all of her son's fraternity brothers. And they all read it, and they all said they had a sense of where he was. And it put them at peace. So that was very helpful. Some of you may have known the Van Cleese who were in town some years ago. And he told me a story. He was working for a hospice, I think in Delaware. It was in the home of an elderly Quaker woman and saw Window to Eternity on her coffee table. No idea how it got there. He said, this is it looks interesting. Do you mind if I borrow it? So he borrowed it, and that began his journey, and they became new church members, and he even came into theological school for a while. So it's good to have those kind of indications that these things are making connections with people. And I always felt that in writing books like this, it's kind of a humbling thing. As I say, I'm not a theologian, but I feel like we're all planting seeds with whatever we do and the gifts that we've been given by the Lord. My wife Carol back there, I often point out that she's a guide at the cathedral in Cairnwood and great ambassador for the church and our religion. There are all different ways that we do this, planting these seeds and introducing people questions by the way we live our lives and so on. So we all have different opportunities to do this kind of work. The second book that Steve mentioned is Why Does God Let It Happen? This came out about 5 years ago. Steve mentioned Rabbi Krishna wrote the book when bad things happen to good people, which I think is about 20 years old. I'm sure a lot of you have read that. While this book was being prepared by the foundation, they sent a copy of the manuscript to him. And he replied very honestly that he sort of thought, oh boy, another one of these. I get these all the time. But he did his job and he read it. He said, this is really different. And he wrote a little blurb that's on the cover that says, the best consideration of God's role in tragedy from a traditional perspective that I've ever read. Rabbi Krishna, he said you can use that on the cover, which we're happy to do so. As a matter of fact, I think he is still in practice up in Boston area somewhere. They tried to get him to come to an event once he wasn't able to. Actually, I was speaking up at the Boston Society, and they tried to get us together. I wasn't able to meet it. But he had a very positive reaction to the book. We also got a good testimonial from Dr. Oz, too, which we use. The foundation uses this online, where he said it was one of the best combinations of theology, common sense, and literature that he had ever read. So all those kind of testimonials help. Rabbi Krishna, I don't know if any of you have read the book, he was spurred to do this by unusual disease that his son had, where he aged very quickly and ended up dying as a 13, 14-year-old. Of course, they were devastated by this, so he started an inquiry into, why does God let these things happen? And he felt that this is the only question that really matters in people's faith. how they reconcile their image of a loving, all-powerful God with all the suffering and the pain and so on that goes on in this world, especially for innocent people. When he was writing his book, I think he got very close to the answers of human freedom and so on, and I think Swedenborg was able to clarify a lot of that for him. But it sort of opened a lot of people's minds to this whole question of why does a loving God let all these things happen, and the importance of our human freedom, that we can't just come down and manipulate things. And people say, why didn't he stop Hitler? Why didn't he stop those planes from crashing into the World Trade Center? Why didn't he stop a child from getting cancer? And when you understand how providence works and permissions and always turning toward good, you begin to get some sense about that there really is a loving God in control of the universe. Obviously, a lot of questions throughout history. A lot of people have had questions throughout history of all this, and I'd like to use the example of C.S. Lewis and Sigmund Freud, who were contemporaries. And both really struggled with this question of suffering. C.S. Lewis has some great books on grief and suffering and so on. He became an atheist after World War I. He had seen so much horror and tragedy and just couldn't reconcile that with the loving God. But he began a real study of Christianity and became one of the foremost champions of Christianity in Europe. Really got the whole concept of a loving God. Freud, on the other hand, was never able to make that reconciliation. Just couldn't understand how a loving God could allow all the suffering in this world. So C.S. Lewis has become a real champion for this sort of thing. Recently I wrote something about this in New Church Life at the Wallace Place, seen this with Stephen Fry, who was a British comedian and so on, a avowed atheist, and someone asked him recently, if you die and you find out there is a God, what are you going to do? Are you going to be humble or apologetic? He said, not at all. He was very angry. He said, I would say to God, cancer in children, what are you thinking? What is this all about? So he still had that anger, this lack of acceptance for why these things happen. So there's still this great need in the world, I think, to explain to people that can have some feeling about there is a reason why things happen, and that the Lord is always leading to good. This community has just been through a very rough experience, and that sort of thing in the last few weeks, seeing this tragedy, but also seeing the response of the community and friends and family, just the overwhelming love that's coming out. And I think that's part of how the Lord heals. The providence is really after the act and what happens rather than the act. So, to me, one of the best images of how God sees our lives and how we see our own lives is in tapestry, needlework. I see Janice coming back here. Carol would probably be doing that if you weren't rushing off to a book club luncheon. But I think when you look at that kind of needlework or a tapestry, and you look at the bottom underneath, you see a lot of knots and threads going in 1,000 directions, and it just looks like kind of chaos. I think that's often what we see in our lives. There's no connection. When you turn it over and you see the beautiful tapestry, and that's what God is seeing in our lives, seeing for our lives. I think it's just a great image. And a lot of what I'm trying to do is just to raise the level of trust in providence. I always used to quote when I'm signing books that peace has within it confidence in the Lord from you can. And I think as people understand more and more how providence works and have trust in the Lord, that really is helping them to see how providence is working in their lives. The third book, which I have written and which is now going through the editing process at the foundation, is about the internal sense of the word. It's called the seventh seal. This is based on the book of Revelation and the opening of the seven seals. You get a lot of dramatic stories. There are forces of different colors and earthquakes and souls cowering under the altar and all that sort of thing. When the seventh seal is open, there's just complete silence in heaven. This is when the Bible is being revealed anew on earth. And it's the Spirit of truth come to lead us into all truths. That's sort of the theme that I use in this book. People throughout the centuries have been trying to figure out what the Bible, what the Word in its natural sense is really saying, that there's got to be something more to this. I don't know if anyone in this audience is lowbrow enough to read Dan Brown's The Lost Symbol. He wrote Da Vinci Code and Angels and Demons. Sort of interesting books, they're kind of beach reads, a lot of history, a lot of drama, and all that sort of thing. Anyway, The Lost Symbol is his search for the internal sense of the word. It says people have been searching for this for centuries. And he goes back through a lot of examples, or Isaac Newton and people like this that wrestle with these questions, try to figure this out. The story that he tells in the book has a lot to do with the Masons and the state of Washington, D.C., and he has this theory that the lost symbol is buried under the Washington Monument. It's inaccessible, it's there. Anyway, I thought it's interesting that he feels that, there is this spiritual sense of the word somewhere, that we have been searching it, and somewhere we will find it. So maybe I'll send him a copy of my book when it's finished and say, we really do have these answers. I was struck a couple of years ago. It was the 400th anniversary of the publication of the King James Bible. And there was a lot written about that at the time. And a woman wrote a letter to the Philadelphia Inquirer, and she said, I've always been discouraged from actually reading the Bible, but now I decided to read it. She said, I read all the horror, the wars, the cruelty, everything else, and I became an atheist. She couldn't see a loving God in what she was reading. And I think a lot of people have trouble with that, especially in the Old Testament, where you have more visions of an angry God and a lot of wars and violence and all sort of things. And what does this mean? I use the example in the book of the destruction of the city Ai, where Joshua was commanded to slay everyone in the town, women, children, babies, and just flatten the town. And how can that have any good meaning at all? When you see what the internal sense is, that it's really talking about destroying our selfish loves. It wasn't about actually destroying children and women and everything else, but really just some real sense and validity to what these stories mean about our own internal battles that are going on all the time in our lives. Don't know if any of you have ever read a book called The Bible That Was Lost and Is Found by John Bigelow. Stehen has. It's a fascinating book, Walter and Catherine. John Bigelow was a very prominent man around the middle of the 19th century. He was a lawyer, a diplomat, a newspaper publisher, very accomplished in a lot of different fields. As a newspaper publisher, he was very anti-slavery. This was about 1850, before the Civil War. And he decided to go down to Haiti to see how the natives there, former slaves, were coping with self-government. So he wanted to do a study. He got down there, and there was an outbreak of, I think it was cholera, I'm not sure, but he was trapped on the island. I think almost everyone on the ship he came with were dead. He was one of the few survivors. And he was stuck for several weeks there in a hotel with one other man, a man from Denmark. John Bigelow had grown up studying the Bible and trying to figure it out. And these two men are sitting in the dining room at this hotel in Haiti by themselves, and he's reading the story about Abram and Sarai, where he is telling her to tell the Pharaoh that she is his sister, not his wife. And he says to this Danish friend, what does this mean? He's lying. He's telling his wife to lie. And we're supposed to think he's an honorable person. And this Danish man says, well, have you ever read Swedenborg? And he hands him the Arcana and the explanation of what this all meant. And John Bigelow immediately became really intrigued with this and started just devouring Swedenborg. But he said he did it as a real skeptic. He was sure that he was going to come across some outrageous statement and just be able to throw this book back at him and say, this just doesn't make sense, this man's an imposter. But he said the more he read it, and he was just devouring everything he could get that Swedenborg had read, he became convinced that this had to be revelation. This could not come from one man's mind. And he finally got back to New Orleans and got up to Mississippi and got some more books of Swedenborg, stopped in Cincinnati, found some more books, read some more, and just became just really a devoted new churchman just from this initial contact of what could this mean, and then getting an answer and reading. I think it's so interesting that he started out as a skeptic, determined to poke holes in all this, and then the more he read, the more he realized that this was really truth from God, and it was just what he was looking for. So I think it's a wonderful story. I've sort of wondered what happened to the Bigelow family, because there aren't any records of Bigelows in convention or anything else, and I think that was a time when a lot of people were interested in Swedenborg and weren't necessarily joining churches or staying with them. So, but it's a great book. It's a little book you can play about an hour or so if you get a chance to look at it sometimes. It's a great story. I try to give the idea throughout this book, and I start out with the first 11 chapters of Genesis being allegorical, the 6 days of creation, how they relate to our own lives, knowing the ark and the Babel, Tower of Babel, that sort of thing. They're not to be taken literally, but there's a real spiritual sense to them. And then just start going through parts of the Word, how the journey of the children of Israel just really relates to our own lives. You know, we often look at that as something that happened thousands of years ago, and as these are just very different people, and they're always making mistakes. They're encouraged by the Lord, and then they're always falling back and asking Aaron to build a golden calf, and all. You wonder what's the matter with these people. And then you realize that the Word is really talking to us. It's about our own lives, and we are the children of Israel. We do this same kind of thing all the time in our own lives. So I'm trying to give a sense in this book that everything in the Word is really speaking to us. It's not irrelevant. It's not just old people and old times and wars and things that happened many, many years ago. It's really talking about what's going on in our lives, and really very relevant right here and now to exactly what's happening with us. Get into the New Testament and how this gives a whole new vision of God, and that it's still the same God in the Old Testament and the New Testament. We just see Him as a visible God, more loving God in the New Testament. For a lot of Christians, they just sort of gravitate, I think, more toward the New Testament because it's an easier God to relate to, and that's where I think the internal sense can really make. We see that same God in the Old Testament who's there in the same way for them. I spent one chapter just on Christmas and Easter because there are stories that are familiar to everybody, but how much they are enriched by the spiritual sense and how much all those stories really come alive in our own lives as well. And then the book of Revelation, that was a real challenge to try to condense that down into one chapter. There's so much there. But just the themes that are there, trying to make sense out of all those cataclysmic images and strange things in there, and how it really makes sense about the hope at the end of the holy city of New Jerusalem descending, and the Spirit of truth come to lead us into all truth. That was a very satisfying chapter to write, to try to bring some sense out of all that. And I feel that trying to make a study of the whole Word like this really comes down to our relationship with God and just the basics of loving God and loving the neighbor. And that's the theme that runs through everything. And I started out saying that I feel that these teachings are all gifts to us, and that what we do with them and helping to share them as part of the Great Commission is our gift back to the Lord. So thank you very much. We're happy to answer a few questions if you have any, or turn this back over to Steve.
Look on why this all that happened. That has been so helpful to many people that we have given it to. And it's really appreciated. I'm sort of amazed in a way, that these people would be so taken and interested. So I think.
Yeah, thank you. Bussy was saying how much this book, Why Does God Let It Happen, is appreciated by people she gives it to. And I hear this all the time from people who give Window to Eternity and Why Does God Let It Happen to friends who maybe outside of the church who have a tragedy or something in their lives. And almost universally get that response that, very appreciative. It gives them a lot of comfort. It helps them in their faith. Window to Eternity also has a chapter on Swedenborg, just a short biography of his life. So a lot of people use that just as an introduction to the church and giving it to people. So I count on you people to do that. You're my marketers, along with my wife, who's very good at that. Thank you. Yes, you can.
They are both of a short enough amount that people can tackle it without feeling intimidated, so I think that's part of their strength. How long is your third book? Is it a similar size?
Yeah, that's a good point, even because one of the challenges is to make this all accessible and readable and not be overwhelming. I mean, especially when you're trying to get the internal sense of the word. I mean, Swedenborg took 30 volumes to do that, so yeah, it's going to be about the same, like about 90, 100 pages, something like that, easily accessible. And I really want all of these books just to be an introduction so that people, it spurs their interest and they go on and read some more on their own. But to make it, easy to read and easy to get through, so thanks for that.
A good tactical choice.
Yes. Yeah.
I have two questions. The internal sense of the word is a very new church saying. Is there a subtitle or something else that will be attached to the outside world? And you are such a good writer. In all those years you wrote all those articles. Did you ever quote Swedenborg in your columns and in your articles?
Yeah, good questions, Beth. Thanks. The first one, I try not to use internal sense and spiritual sense so much as talk about inner meanings, spiritual meanings that sort of enrich the natural sense and try to give people a sense still that there's still real power in the natural sense of the word. But this is just something that enriches it, that gives it more meaning in their lives. So, I'm very aware that I'm introducing people to a new concept here, but that people have sort of had this hunger that there must be more meaning here. There's sort of indications throughout the word that, and the Lord even explaining some of the parables does that. The parable of the sower, for instance, tells what it means in the talents and so on. As far as did I ever quote Swedenborg, I don't know that I quoted him directly, but I sure did indirectly. And I love doing columns for Christmas and Easter and Thanksgiving and so on, and found those are often the ones I got the best response to. That they had a real new church flavor to them, whether people recognize it or not, but people responded to it very well. So I felt that was a real opportunity that I had to sort of plant those seeds and get some thoughts out there that people appreciated. So there are a lot of ways to do it, yeah. Yes?
You bring up so many interesting topics, but you mentioned atheists, and I heard Terry Gross speak about her conversation with Maurice Sendak, and he said, I'm an absolute atheist, but I'm quite positive when I die I'll see my little brother. People are open to learning. You can tell when they say something like that, even though they say they're atheists.
Yeah, I think they're hoping not to be disappointed. Yeah, I think that's really quite common, that they aren't quite sure what to believe, and some of these things in the Bible sort of turn them off, but still they have this hope that there's going to be some meaning there. One of my favorite books of all time that just sort of relates to this is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, who was a survivor of prison camp in World War II. He became a psychiatrist and developed a theory called logopractice, I think. But he had this feeling that people in those terrible prison camps, the ones who had meaning in their lives or had some purpose, were the ones who survived. And the ones who didn't, you can almost predict which ones would make it and which ones wouldn't really have a sense of purpose or meaning in their lives. So, very important. Okay, well, thanks very much. I'm going to turn this back to Steve before I get a little playing.
Bruce mentioned John Bigelow. In addition to the things that Bruce said about this remarkable fellow, he was a personal friend of Otto von Bismarck's and worked actively to prevent France, I believe, from coming in the side of the Confederacy in the Civil War. And he was that correct?
Yeah.
Bruce? I believe that's so. And he
Also
also
helped to found the
New York Public Library. He was a co-founder of New York Public Library. And he helped bring down the Boss Tweed
Yes.
in the Boss Tweed corruption cartel in New York City when he was, I believe he was Attorney General of the state of New York.
Yeah.
He's quite a remarkable fellow. At any rate, I wanted to say a few words about one of my favorite books, which is for sale upstairs, and it's called Mentics. And it was authored by Oliver and Rachel Odner. And Rachel is here with us today. And it's a small book, but like the Hebrew letter Yoda, I believe that's how you pronounce Yoda. It's small but mighty. Small but mighty. And that's what the Hebrew letter Yoda means as well. So that little green character in Star Wars with the leaf-shaped ears, in fact, is a mirror of the leaf-shaped letter, Hebrew letter Yoda. And I found that this book itself has so much power in it because it's the mind modeling method. It was put together over the course of years by Rachel and Oliver. And I had the good fortune of spending multiple visits with Rachel and Oliver up in their home in Kempton. Beginning about this time last year, in the course of Oliver's decline, he eventually passed into the spiritual world last autumn. And but during that time, I was able to discuss the book with him on multiple occasions. I have to tell you, this is not an easy book to describe, and it's not an easy book to read, honestly. However, it is a very worthwhile book to read because in addition to being a window into how the mind works, it's a wonderful book for mental push-ups. I mean, everybody wants to buy a book on how to tone up your body. This is a book on how to tone up your mind. Really, this will stretch your mind to the limit. It's got a very unique vocabulary. And because it's got a very unique vocabulary, it takes some time and effort. You take it in small bites, you work your way through it, read it through, and you begin to see what they're trying to say and go over it yet again and again. And I've read it 4 times and I'm starting to really get it. But it's worth every minute of it. I'll read you some of the table of contents to give you an idea of what's contained. It begins with whole and parts. And Oliver and Rachel say that an idea is an urge to have and know other ideas. And that in itself is sort of an abstract thought. And the meaning of that doesn't come across immediately until you begin to really start to think deeply about it. The whole is an idea that has and knows its parts. And when we discussed the meaning of has, we sort of came up with the idea that maybe has means like a woman has a baby. It's not just owning it, it's actually having it in the sense of it's born in your mind. And then you have it, and then you cherish it as well. And that's a deeper meaning of has. They talk about a model of space and symbolism, a model of time and concepts, a model of motion and action, wisdom and love analogy, memory, a map of the mind, threshold of knowledge, the corporeal mind, the mind's threshold. And they talk at length with diagrams, which are a little scary when you first look at these diagrams. Sorry, Rachel, but they're a little scary when you first look at them. But when you get to know them and see them and they begin to make sense, they're some of the most beautiful diagrams you can imagine. They talk about motives, qualia, images, habits, train of thoughts, focus of attention, reflex loops, objects and archetypes, and correspondences. So I highly recommend this little book. Once again, it is a book of, it's going to require a little effort, and I hope that someday, this becomes a course of study here in the college. It really should be taught as a course of study. I know that in all institutions, the new church is interested in the human mind and consciousness for obvious reasons. And this is, I believe, a wonderful adjunct to that study. So in another 15 minutes or so, my friend Ian Thompson will be here to begin his presentation, and I'll introduce Ian then. Thank you.